Like there's the cat in the background again. Was it a cat fight that there was in the background that you said?
No, it's just one cat by itself doing zoomies. I think it's on a path of its own. I don't quite know which one, but it's clearly moving fast. Yeah. Mm.
So we're back on. This session is going to be on the path of combat. Just so if somebody's joining this and you've never seen us talk, we're doing a series on paths of archetypes. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people right now are in the middle of rethinking their life path. And often it's very complicated to do when you only have a job or a hobby to actually choose from. And what we're doing here is that we're exploring this mandala kind of concept, with each of these little pictures being one archetype. And an archetype is a symbolic role that you take that can help you to live your life in a more fulfilling way. And each of these paths is organized in 3 different bubbles. The one that I'm showing here is today's one. And we're going through each path one by one. So there's 15 episodes. Today's the path of combat. I'm going to zoom in a second so you can see we talk about 3 different archetypes today. We're talking about the hunter, the warrior, and the strategist. The first one being the yin archetype, the one where you receive. The second is the yang archetype, where you more like focus on the out and give. And the strategist is the balance of the first 2. And we'll be walking through this. Jonas, my brother and the therapist, is also going to be sharing some thoughts and stories from his practice. This is a symbolic journey of combat. We're not talking about actually going out and fighting people. Of course, there's a lot of martial arts which help you to channel that aggression. But the topic of today is not so much to do the praise of just the martial arts itself, but it's about talking about aggression and using those archetypes to create a new version of yourself by combining archetypes from this wheel. So maybe Jonas, like let's start from the beginning with Path of Combat. You were saying earlier that combat is something that we need to be careful about. We're not encouraging violence and aggression, are we here?
No, the idea is to look at it more in terms of how do we deal with fighting? Because we inevitably are confronted with opposition, negativity, frustration. Within ourselves, we fight certain tendencies or certain things that we don't like. People tend to judge themselves even more harshly than they judge other people. You can see this in how they talk to themselves. And the idea is that we all inevitably have to sometimes fight. We can do it more or less consciously, but one of the most common things that we have to fight against is fear. And if we just imagine for a second not fighting fear, not dealing with fear, and just attacking, destroying whatever actually scares you without having the ability to tolerate that. Imagine a situation where you're walking in the street and the minute you start to feel a little bit suspicious of someone, you just went out there and just destroyed them. I mean, you'd end up in jail, and that would be very, very destructive. Also at the level of a society, if in history, the minute a country had gotten a little bit scared of a neighbor, it had nuked it, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. Nuclear warfare would have happened at least, I'm guessing a dozen times at the very least. But so the idea to frame this conversation is that this is really about how do we deal with the fighting energy. What do we fight for? What do we fight against? How do we deal with conflict and strategic use of, for example, violence? In some ways, it doesn't have to be physical, but sometimes you have to choose to go out and accept and own the fact that you're in disagreement, or that you're trying to protect or take something from a metaphorical person. And the idea is to help reflect on what is a balanced way to use that energy, and what is a healthy way to use those energies, and basically tackle the question of our relationship to fear and to discomfort as well. Because whether it's an actual soldier that's preparing to go out to war, or whether it's just an office worker listening to an inspirational podcast every day on his commute, there's often this sense that we have to acknowledge that there's going to be a certain level of discomfort that we're trying to prepare for. A certain type of risk might not be life or death. In the case of the office worker, hopefully his commute doesn't involve them risking their life every single day. But yeah, the idea is that there's often some degree of discomfort that you have to choose to embrace, and risk that you have to choose in order to successfully fight for or against anything. So yeah, this is more about the metaphoric fight, not so much the how to become the best soldier. Although technically we'll cover some points from that, just from the general perspective of how does one put up a good fight. But yeah, I don't think this is going to be boot camp.
You talked about discomfort. I think what's really interesting is that today, when you look at cancel culture, this whole idea that when you don't want to have a conversation, you just basically cancel the other person out. I think there's an interesting link between the path of combat, which is associated with fighting, and discomfort, and actually having tricky conversations. For example, at work, I think the word courage is that if you take the first archetype here, which is the hunter, archetypally is the person who goes out and searches and goes beyond their fear, masters their courage to go out and get something better, to go out and either it's hunting in a metaphorical sense, or of course you could actually go out and hunt, but or foraging for that matter. There might be taking some risks in certain climates, but the notion of courage with the discomfort is really interesting right today, because I don't have the data on this, but it seems that there is a change of ability to face discomfort in people's different opinions. At least in the workplaces I've been working on, I've definitely noticed a trend towards less tolerance of discomfort. And that it would be nice if there was a bit more courage around facing difficult conversations. No, I noticed this. I was talking to this one HR manager who said, in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the definition of privilege is when you actually are able to not have the uncomfortable conversations.
Mm.
So that is actually having a privilege, is to not have those. So being able to have the courage of difficult, uncomfortable conversations is also a form of courage. You could hunt for difficult conversations without it actually being going out in nature and hunting an animal. So what do you have, Jonas, on the archetype of hunter from a therapy perspective? Like, what have you noticed around this that could help us to choose these archetypes wisely?
If we look at it in the context of therapy, there's the question of reassuring oneself, right? Because I think it's safe to say most people have fear of something. So here we have to maybe distinguish between anxiety, which we could maybe describe more as this general sense of panic, and fear, but there's not necessarily an object. You're not necessarily scared of something. It's just more often like a physical sensation of people just freaking out, feeling like something terrible is about to happen, but not necessarily knowing what. And then you've got specific fears, like you can have some very elaborate neurotic scenarios where fears are consciously constructed, where, for example, someone might say, I'm terrified that if I tell my boss what I really think, I'm going to get fired, I'll end up unemployed, there's no way I'll find a job in these times, I'll end up living under a bridge or having to sell heroin or my body to survive. Like something like really extreme like that. And very often a necessary step is to already accept that we're all bound to be afraid of something, right? Like it's an inevitable part of our biology, and there are things that can get in the way of us calming ourselves down and being stuck in a constant state of fear. But for most people, fear is a normal occurrence, and we live in environments that are very fear-inducing, right? The media, you can play emotional bingo whenever you're looking at a media source, and just pick emotions that they're trying to make you feel, or that you're very likely to feel, and you'll see that fear is one of the top emotions that you'll see whenever you're consuming media content. Doom scrolling, like they call it, and the thing is, it's actually not that straightforward to reassure oneself. Very often you'll have two big strategies, right? Either you distract yourself from the fear, so like, don't be scared, just don't think about it. It's not going to happen. Push that idea out of your head and, just be brave and just ignore it. And then you've got the other approach, which is more like desensitizing yourself. Let's imagine you're scared of diving off a dive board. Well, start from 1 meter, then bump it up to 2 meters, then bump it up to 5 meters, but don't start trying to dive off the 5 meter plank, because the level of fear is going to be paralyzing and you're more likely to actually hurt yourself, even though there wasn't a risk to start with. So what I notice in the context of therapy is that it's very important to just make space for it to be okay to be scared of certain things, to also make space for the fact that we might know that it's irrational, but it doesn't mean that we can make the emotion go away. We can acknowledge, I know it's an irrational fear, but I feel it anyway. It's generally very necessary. And then it's something that we probably benefit from working on in general. It's a muscle reassuring oneself and giving a good constructive meaning or positive meaning to that specific type of discomfort is probably useful and interesting. And it is, we do live in a context, in a society where we tend to give a negative meaning to discomfort in general. Fear is a bad thing. It's like pain. We shouldn't feel it. We shouldn't experience it. You should, erase it from your life, and that will translate into happiness, which doesn't seem realistic or really useful. And there are forms of fear, right? Don't get me wrong. Forms of fear that we could do without, like terror that leads to trauma. Extreme feelings of powerlessness, things like that, dehumanizing experience. Yeah, I'm not saying that, that's just necessary evil. Just let's deal with it. But I'm talking about the giving a positive meaning to everyday fears, and even seeing that they have the potential to yield something sometimes even beautiful. There's and translate into good self-esteem, for example. When you've scared yourself, you've done something that was hard, freaked you out, and you managed, or even if you don't manage, but at least you know that you gave it a solid shot. In any case, it has the potential to make you feel better about yourself. So yeah, the level of the hunter, the level of courage, I think that's something we all more or less consciously have had to deal with in our lives. And probably as a reflection question, you could ask yourself, am I scaring myself in the right ways and for the right reasons?
Mm. Also, I was just like, as you were talking through this, there's it reminded me of, I can't remember who was talking about this, but this idea of distancing yourself from your feelings. Like if there's fear, you can say I am afraid, or you can say a part of me is afraid, and that very formulation as a piece of me gives me a power over it, gives me a possibility of choosing still to go through that fear and not necessarily being paralyzed and overtaken by that fear. What was it called again? I have to look this up and I'll post it. But this notion of courage and fear is not the absence of fear. It's the ability to actually hold your own space for that fear without being completely overwhelmed and controlled by that fear. So the hunter is a great archetype because in all the pop culture and mythology and movies, we have examples of the hunter who goes out and who's going to brave the elements to bring back something of value. But of course, in today's society, the hunter archetype could be, for example, a salesperson who gets a lot of rejection. It could be a person who's on the street who's actually handing out, NGO flyers or trying to get money and petitions for causes and so on. So there's a number of places where the hunter archetype can be that is not traditionally, going to hunt or going into the fight itself. What about the warrior archetype, the second one, which is the more outward focusing, the warrior focused on aggression and violence seems to be a tension here that often people confuse aggression and violence. What's your take on that, Jonas?
If we look at the difference between just drunk people fighting in a street fight, pure violence, uncontrolled, just really trying to destroy another person, versus calculated use of force for strategic reasons, well, the warrior has prepared, and in an ideal sense, they fight for a reason, for a cause, they're trained, they embrace the risk, and they practice for it, they drill for it, they practice for the fear, they practice for the discomfort, they practice pushing boundaries for the sake of pushing boundaries and creating a wariness of the mind. Like that's something you'll see if you look at a lot of different special forces trainings. They often just push them to the limit just to get them to realize, see, there's what you think you're going to be able to do, and there's what you can actually do in practice, which is pretty much limitless until your body breaks. But even if you're not afraid of your body breaking and you stop avoiding unpleasantness and pain, and you just accept it and move on anyway, you can achieve amazing things. So a lot of people push that way too far and end up really destroying themselves, pursuing some kind of nebulous alpha dream, which is, of course, a pitfall of this. And some people also fall into this archetype because they feel that, like, oh, well, then I'm not going to feel fear anymore. If I scare myself enough, um, it's going to become courage. But yeah, that can be true to some extent. But if if it's an avoidance of bigger problems, then yeah, they're just going to show up in another way. You can be sure of that. But the way I understand the warrior level is really this conscious preparation and drilling, and really having a clear fight, a clear cause, and a strategy, some kind of specialization as well. You're not just running onto the battlefield swinging a sword. You've trained to your advantage. Like if you have a specific body type, for example, you would choose a martial art that fits your body type. If we're talking about martial arts, if we're talking about something a little bit more related to civilian life, well, then it could be you are really practicing the specific type of conflict that you're encountering in your professional space. So you have your drill. I don't know, let's imagine you've had a lot of experience with dealing with narcissists in your life. Well, that's when you would really develop a conscious recipe for dealing with narcissists and not having to compromise or not having to run away from a situation, but being able to face it and still protect your own safety and your own needs, essentially. So I just see it as more formalized and um, more deliberate in a way.
To me, when you talked about the sort of non-combat aspect of it, the sort of non-martial art, it reminds me of work when I've been in a number of situations where, as a facilitator, I've had to have the courage and some degree of aggression to be able to host a safe space. As sort of counterintuitive as it may seem, sometimes it takes a little bit of that social aggression to create enough space for a conflict to unfold harmoniously, where it doesn't become just like a destruction of trust, but it builds trust. Like example I had was I was invited an event in CERN in Geneva. I was hosting a workshop, and after a few hours of that, it turned into a conflict. Now I could either ignore the conflict, and the conflict was because of the participants who had very large egos, who were sort of arguing about how to do things and who were not really willing to go beyond their fear and have a real conversation. So it turned into a conflict. So I looked at the person who invited me there, and I got a non-verbal agreement that this was like, okay, now we need to switch gears. Took my courage and voiced the situation as objectively and non-judgmentally as possible. Voiced the elephant in the room, if you like, and said like, this is what's happening. We have this, we have this. What can we learn from it? How might we use this in the context of what we're doing today? And suddenly the dimension shifted from being everybody against themselves arguing to a collective, okay, inquiry around, and using that aggression as a power to just move through that uncomfortable situation, which turned out really well. So I think in work context, aggression can also be the person who says the thing that nobody really wants to talk about, but is actually helping the collective to move forward and become wiser and perhaps more aligned on difficult assumptions that haven't actually been voiced. So do you have any examples in therapy, Jonas, around people who've come to you with like really high aggression or even some violence issues, and how would you approach that from a therapy perspective?
So a profile that I see quite often is generally a man who comes across as a really nice guy, very polite, very agreeable, and who reports having a huge amount of violent clashes with the people closest to them. And what you often see with this kind of pattern is that it's someone that tries very hard not to get angry. It's someone that
Mm.
gives a negative meaning to their negative emotions, and generally that's been abundantly reinforced by the environment as well, with amazing supportive phrases such as "You're crazy," "You just go ballistic," "You just lose your shit," "You're just an insane person," "You're just like your dad," which is one that men generally love as well. So you have all these ways in which that behavior is judged and interpreted, which is you've lost control, you're a crazy person, you have issues, You have unchecked baggage. This is not my problem to deal with. You have to deal with your emotions yourself. And so these typically guys often come to therapy and genuinely feel that they have to cure themselves from this disease, which is anger. But the problem is they're not looking at their anger in a way that is actually creating a problem they can solve. They're seeing anger as something undesirable instead of seeing it as a warning sign of a deeper need that's not being met. And so very often you need to, to put it simply, get them to accept that they need to, as soon as they feel that anger, all the precursors to anger, such as fear, irritation, exhaustion, or whatever state might come just before they actually lose their shit. And that's often interesting to try and express and deal with earlier on and in a different way so that it doesn't result in anger. But the problem is not compromising more. Generally, what you see, the paradox with these people, is that they often spend their time trying to shut their mouth and compromise and adapt to the other person and not make it about them. And then there are, of course, moments where that just becomes completely impossible, and then it flips 100%. So I think we often misunderstand anger and some of these negative emotions. And there's also the very tricky question of responsibility. Let's imagine that, Estève, you and I are having a conversation and you scare me, and I get defensive because I interpret and perceive an attack and a criticism in what you've said. Who's responsible for me feeling scared? Is it and to what proportion? Is it allowed even to say that that responsibility is mutually shared? That I might have some responsibility for my fear and my triggers and my interpretation of your behavior. Let's imagine in this example, I don't tell you, I'm sorry, you said something about ears. Did you mean to say that I have big ears? Are you criticizing? Are you saying that basically my ears are too big? Is that what you're saying? It's already quite different if I'm able to take responsibility and check instead of just assuming that in fact you're taking the piss and you think that I have elephant ears. You know? So yeah, the question of responsibility for negative emotions. I mean, I'm not going to tackle it today. That's above my pay grade. But it's an interesting one to reflect on. And like many things, it's probably a bit slippery when it starts to become too black and white. If it's as clear cut as, no, whoever the aggressor is responsible for the emotions and should be the one to change their behavior, well, then we end up in stuck situations and the beautiful drama triangle that we've talked about a few times already.
I'll bring it back up actually because it's I think it's super relevant. I think what you said reminded me of a workshop I did on anger management a few years ago, where there was a huge distinction between aggression and violence. Aggression being the natural, animalistic, and primal expression of something to get oneself out of a situation that might be dangerous or problematic, and violence is the received side of that's negative. And you can have aggression without violence, but you can also have violence perceived without hardly any aggression at all. And often people confuse aggression and violence, and that's where the violence is from the point of view of the person receiving it. Like you said, I'm responsible for my triggers. Aggression is the person giving, and then who's responsible? Like from what I've seen in business and HR, cultures who encourage only taking responsibility for the aggressors become very quickly dysfunctional, whereas those who encourage people to look at themselves, at their own sensitivities and triggers, become much more harmonious because they allow the fact that both sides have a responsibility. Do you want to talk us through, in this context of the aggressor and the warrior, the victim, savior, aggressor triangle? If I just put it up, like how does this relate to the warrior archetype here?
So the warrior can step in at a few different levels, right? It could be the savior that sees an injustice in the world, right? Let's imagine you see someone's bag being stolen in public and someone chasing a thief, and the savior could step in and be the warrior and choose to act to stop the actual aggression or to stop the theft. You could have the warrior at the level of someone who feels victimized, and that justifies violence and destruction of the other party, right? which in history we have an abundant. And I mean, I'm trying to think if there's ever a war that hasn't been justified by we were attacked, so we're just defending ourselves. Cold War narrative, medieval narrative for some of those fights. I mean, recent examples everywhere. I mean, literally, pretty much every conflict that you can think of that's been recorded uses that kind of line at some point of "I'm a victim, so that justifies my aggression." So this, I think, framework is interesting at this level to help us ask ourselves, with what mandate am I stepping in and choosing to potentially exercise some force or potentially actively disagree or fight against someone else, even metaphorically, right? Not physically. So on what basis am I going out there and being militant about anything, for example, whether it's human rights, the right to, I don't know, lobbying for a specific law, whatever it is. But I think if more of us challenge the legitimacy and the why we do something, and also make that more explicit, that protects us from entering the drama triangle, which is basically the recipe for the most toxic form of conflict that never ends and just keeps on escalating and roping more people in. So I think, this is just this recipe, this triangle is a good point of reference as to what not to do. And so if we look at specifically each role, to step away from it, if we feel victimized, the question to make sure that we're being fair to ourselves and to other people is to ask, how responsible am I for this situation, be it in the past, in the present? Is there anything that I've done, even if it's not been meant, that is interpreted in a way that has led to me being in this situation and feeling attacked, or objectively being attacked right now? Because no responsibility, no control. Then you're indeed purely a victim of what's happening to you, and you can exercise no control. If you're catching yourself more in the savior role, you can ask yourself the question, who has given me the mandate, and have I been asked to help in a way that I can actually deliver? Because a complaint is not a request for help. If I tell you, Estève, I have a problem with my car, I have a headache, I've had my wisdom teeth removed and it hurts, am I actually asking you for anything? I'm just complaining. But
just venting. Yeah, exactly.
If you're a super savior, you'll tell me to go and buy aspirin, you'll tell me off because I haven't taken my car to the mechanic, or fix my problem in whatever way I didn't ask you to. So to protect yourself from being a savior, make it explicit. I noticed that you're venting a lot, Jonas. Is there anything that I can do besides maybe provide a welcoming pair of ears to support you? Is there anything that you actually want me to do about the problem? Can I actually do anything? And even if the person explicitly asks you for help, you also have to be able to be honest with yourself as to if you're able to deliver. If someone comes up to me and says, well, you're a shrink, you're a medical professional, right? Could you help me figure out if this cancer treatment is right for my relative? Well, I mean, I could want to help as much as I want, but I'm not qualified for that. So I wouldn't actually be helping that person, even if I was trying to help. So are you able and willing to help in that way is an important question, not to become just the archetypal shining knight in silver armor that ends up doing more bad than good. And if you find yourself in the aggressor role, which is where you really have decided that you're actively going against someone, I don't know, let's imagine verbal abuse in a traffic, like,
I was going to say traffic in Marseille, where you live, is probably a good example of that. Yeah.
So what am I trying? Like, if I'd separate the ends from the means, what am I literally, what am I hoping for when I'm calling this other person name? Because part of me actually at this point just wants to punish the other person. And first of all, is that punishment even going to land? Is it going to make a difference? Is that person even going to be more careful next time they're driving? I'm not sure. And is there maybe a better strategy? Even if I want to really communicate, even if my goal is to change the other person's behavior, maybe I'll have a better chance doing so without insulting them, and maybe trying to actually talk and say, look, I realize you probably didn't do this on purpose. Maybe you're having a bad day. I don't know what's going on in your life, but right there, that was really fucking dangerous. You could have killed me. And I would really appreciate if you just were a little bit more vigilant. I mean, of course, there's no guarantee that even that would change the other person's behavior, but it's less likely to end up in a street fight in the middle of traffic with two people that are convinced that they're right and that God is on their side and that the other person needs to be destroyed. But yeah, the question of, did I choose the right strategy to reach my goal? And what is my goal anyway? Because often it gets a bit confused. We're trying to teach them a lesson, punish them, and communicate the fact that we were thoroughly offended and scared. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, if we think about it as a communication exercise, that's three big types of information being conveyed in one insult. The chances are very low that the other person would be able to make any sense out of that, and it doesn't really give the other person a choice. It kind of invites them to respond in the same way. So then you just have which can be a beautiful exercise in itself to witness from the sideline, right? A creative insult match. In Marseille, we have some very colourful ways of describing each other. So I mean, yeah, that can be entertaining in an unhealthy way. But yeah, there are a few different angles to step away from the drama triangle, and there's an abundance of literature on this. I'm just brain porridging an explanation on this, but you can find some higher resolution information on this if you're interested.
Yeah, and what I wanted to just point out as well, because this diagram we've been using together when we do these conflict boot camps, where we help people to actually transform conflicts from a destructive conflict to a positive conflict. I think the unlocking of this triangle, which is eternal, because you can see this across countries. The shift of roles is the problem. It's not that being a victim or an aggressor or savior. It's that when you're in one of them, you're automatically going to become another one over time, and it gets an infernal circle that just downward spirals into constant violence and aggression without any respite. So to get out of it, to unlock it, it's the top right corner. There's an interesting little switch that most people don't think of, which is that the intentions behind it, like you hinted with the car traffic thing. If your intention to yourself is unclear, obviously it's going to be dysfunctional, it's going to destroy trust, and it's going to be a toxic conflict. But if by that moment you suddenly have that little moment of insight of what's my intention here, okay, really, what is my intention? And also at the same time thinking, what is the other person's intention? If they're, for example, if it's unclear why a person has done something, if at that moment miraculously you're able to switch from actually given a trial of intention, which means that I don't know, therefore I assume it's bad, to a credit of positive intention on the right hand side there, suddenly what most often happens is that the other person upward spirals out of it. And after a few revs, sometimes it's enough to completely de-escalate any conflict. Because if you say, you probably had a good reason to cut me off, I just don't understand what it is, it's quite different than saying you're being an ass because you cut me off. Because there is a chance that the other person might have had an intention that we didn't know. They might be having a bad day, but it also just might be that there is an unclear intention on both sides. So often it's enough to just disengage from this whole toxic mess by allowing the other person to have an intention that we haven't read, that we haven't heard, and that they haven't even expressed, which might be symptom of an unfulfilled need that they haven't yet expressed. And in that sense, being able to see that we are often just creating drama out of this is also why it's called the drama triangle, out of thin air, that there is no reality to it, that we read into people's behaviors some form of aggression when in fact it was just our own mind games and drama triangles playing out from our history. It actually reduces quite a lot of the tensions that we see around. And what I wanted to highlight here is that we go back to the archetype wheel here. If I look at the warrior, often people take, I mean, in my circles, there's a lot of guys who are into, and girls as well, into spiritual warrior notion. So I'm not gonna fight against people, but I'm gonna be a better version of me. I'm gonna use that warrior energy, that aggression, to to fight my inner battles. Now, there's obviously a good side to that, which is, taking responsibility for one's own spiritual journey and growth. Great. But there's a dark side to that as well, which maybe you could open up a little bit in terms of therapy.
I mean, it's already the analogy in itself, right? It's this idea that balancing yourself out or striving for something that you want, it could be happiness in the broader sense of the term, or achievement, performance, or something. Well, if you're looking at everything as a fight, chances are the universe will provide you with an abundance of fights and conflicts. And there's often an excessively dark side given to the notion of combat, as in it has to be about destruction, it has to be dirty, and the ends justify the means. It has to be trench warfare. You can just really get down and dirty, go to the pits of hell and fight your demons there, and then you'll come out on the other side feeling like Zeus. Which I don't know about you, Estève. I haven't met many people that have had that experience. Certainly not my experience of the pits of hell. And one of the pitfalls is construing everything as a fight and giving a bad connotation to the notion of conflict and just combat in general. Martial arts is interesting in that sense that some are very, very functional. Krav Maga, just really, no matter what you have in your environment, you have to be able to fight off a group of people that are trying to kill you, versus other, maybe more aesthetic-based forms of martial art, like capoeira, which has more music and dance.
Or sword fighting. I was just the other day, I did an
fighting,
introduction to the good old-fashioned medieval sword fighting with big, we started with wooden and then went on to metal, but it's like, it's really not going to help you in the street, but it's definitely a beautiful art in itself.
And you can gain principles. There are many parallels between fighting and dancing, if you think about it. The notion of choreography. Look at what places in the world you have a studio with mats, mirrors on all walls, where it's either where people are dancing or where they're practicing fighting, or they have some, well, not all forms of combat and martial arts. There are some training gyms, boxing gyms, so they don't have mirrors on the walls everywhere. But there is quite a bit of similarity between those practices. So what I would encourage people to do is to also maybe pose the question of if their battle could be described as a dance between things, where you're kind of maybe also practicing, drilling certain movements, willing to make yourself uncomfortable, training certain things, but where it doesn't have to be fighting against something. Imagine the difference between fighting your anxiety and learning to dance with it so that it can still keep you, give you some of its positives. Look at the difference between fighting against your boss and traffic, or dancing around the problem and finding creative ways to feel less stuck on your commute.
It's a beautiful metaphor. Yeah.
So
it's like in communication. I think the metaphor of music, like the tension between people, can be something that you need to remove. Like in the Nordic countries, often people are just very, very aware of tensions as being negatives, and suddenly they want to remove all tensions and don't voice the intent. But actually, those tensions could be like the guitar string, where if you have all the tensions between people put side by side, it's just a question of tuning those harmoniously so that those tensions can create beautiful music. So similarly to the metaphor you used of dancing with it, music, there's something that suddenly it becomes not a bad thing, but it becomes, how do we adjust it and play with it?
And to maybe go back to some very fundamental assumptions that I'm making by saying this, I'm working from the premise that a certain degree of discomfort is inevitable, that some degree of fear is inevitable, and that fighting in itself, having a different perspective from someone, having different interests, having opposing interests with someone, doesn't have to be a problem in itself. And there's something you were saying between aggression and violence. I noticed that there's a lot of violence without aggression in today's world, in the form of this very false positive kind of narrative that you'll have on certain topics and certain issues, in the idea that you'll have people, you see this at the level of conversation in relationships, for example, where one partner will be very calm to the other one and just basically completely invalidate each other's feelings, but they'll use a lot of jargon from the spiritual world, for example. And I think, yeah, I think your wounds are unchecked, and I think you just need to do some more self healing. I don't think you're mature enough for us to have this relationship and this conversation. There's no aggression in the voice, but it's an incredibly violent thing that you're saying. You're essentially saying, you're the whole problem. I'm better than you. You're not good enough for me, and I'm not giving you a choice. It's not something you can fix. I am rejecting you, and you just have to accept this. It's non-negotiable. And that can come out in the form of a big smiling person covered in crystals and that has a vegan diet. Or you'll have it in excuses like people writing off their toxic personality traits just because they're such and such a star sign. Oh no, that's just a Gemini thing. I don't have to change that. That's who I am, you know. And you'll have all sorts of very violent things that can happen in interactions and relationships, without people kicking and screaming. And the other way around, it can be actually very playful and healing to have a partner that's mature enough to tell you, okay, I'm gonna vent. It's not to be taken personally, but like really, like, fuck you. Just okay. So now that that's said, let's move on with our day, and that can actually be healthier than someone who is just becoming cold, distant, punishing their partner with silence, but technically not demonstrating any active aggression. And of course, there's a huge amount of cultural variation to this, personality variation to this. You and I, right now, where we're sitting, the norm in the people around you is less explicit conflict, less emotion, and that's where people feel safer. Where I'm sitting, it's the exact opposite. If you're too cold and distant, it's interpreted as a threat, as there must be something wrong. This person must be trying to screw me over. So I'm going to be more distant and more vigilant as well. So you have to interpret all these things carefully, and even culture, like it's a simplification of reality, of course, but still, one has to be mindful that there is no um, universal norm for this, but the questions that we can ask ourselves, they're universal. So again, at the level of the warrior, why am I fighting? What am I fighting for? And how am I practicing this? What risks am I taking? And how am I negotiating this relationship to risk? You can see this in business as well, the aggression of just aggressively pursuing your interests. And doing so, you can do so very aggressively and respectfully and mindfully, or you can do so in a very dishonest way, like a 1950s snake oil rep, where you're just trying to screw people over to get what you want. So I would argue that you can be very aggressive but still respectful and honest, and you could be very, very agreeable and actually be profoundly violent and disrespectful. So it's really case by case.
Perceived as, yeah, and there's like, so therefore this invites as well, if we think of the path of combat and martial arts, to carefully consider the context. Often we think of violence and aggression as being a singular thing between one person or group of people, but actually it's very contextual. If the person's triggers from their past sensitivities is one, it's going to change completely the way they receive your behavior. And that's something we've been measuring as well with the conflict triggers that people have are so diverse that we can't possibly avoid all triggers. They're just, so that's where it links back to the archetype of the strategist, which is managing the risk. There is going to be an inevitable amount of discomfort. The more diverse the group, and the trend towards diversity in business right now is a great one, but it also increases the chance of misunderstandings and conflicts due to people's behaviors that are misunderstood. Because, when we started measuring conflicts, a little anecdote is that our clients were saying to us, it's the conflicts are coming because of gender, or the conflicts are gender inequality, or the conflicts are coming because of pay or power dynamics, or they had all these hypotheses. And I asked them, well, why do you think that is? Where do you think it comes from? What's the trigger? And they said, it's obvious, isn't it? It's because of this. They had this ready-made motorway of thinking that they had recycled from online. And when we started measuring, we found that the number one trigger was not any of those. It was just people's behaviors, which of course is fantastically difficult because a behavior is contextual. If I'm a Finn, a behavior that is okay here, as you pointed out, in Marseille, in France, will probably be construed very differently than the intention of the Finn initially had. And that means that there's so much possible misunderstandings. It's a miracle that we managed to deal with all that risk of misunderstanding. So the martial art here is a great metaphor and a great practice, because it allows you to sort of dance with that risk, dance with the aggression and the pullback and the aggression and the sort of learning about yourself and the other in that dynamic play. But maybe you have some other things to add about the risk management of the strategist, Jonas.
Yeah, there's this notion that if you're connected to reality, then chances are you have the humility to understand you can't fully predict it, right? I'm hoping no one listening to us believes that they can 100% predict what is going to happen. Otherwise, I mean, either you're going to be a millionaire or you're going to be very, very disappointed. So that being said, you can never fully predict an outcome. And whenever you anticipate something, you're imagining it based on your past patterns and experience. And if you want to scare yourself with how unreliable your mind is, I would recommend reading Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow by Kahneman. Beautiful book that describes how flawed our thinking is, especially one of the two systems. He talks about system 1, system 2. So anyway, we can't really predict the future. We can't guarantee that we don't take risks. And if we still are brave enough, there's still stuff that we want. So we have to inevitably, to go back to the very beginning basic building block of this, we have to accept that we're going to go out into the forest hungry with a bow and fishing rods, and that we could end up potentially being grizzly bear chowder, like chow, or we could walk home with some delicious salmon. So how do we navigate? How do we find, like, do we go out into the woods every day and think, fuck it, I'm big enough to take a polar bear or a grizzly bear? Or do we never go and we think, no, berries are good. I mean, nutritional value is not great, but really, like, who needs salmon, really? I mean, come on, at the end of the day. So we have to develop in order to maximize our gains, we have to find some kind of a strategy, some kind of method to the madness, and prepare ourselves. So reduce the risk, accept a certain risk, develop levers for control, influence, and, for example, in the case of getting what you want in relationships, it's about communicating in a way that's honest with yourself and honest with other people, not nice, honest, to make sure that you're able to negotiate fairly. Let's imagine something as small as fixing an appointment. Like, let's imagine, Estève, you and I are trying to agree on a time for a catch-up. If I don't respect myself in the negotiation, if I'm just nice and I just comply to the first suggestion you make, over the course of a whole relationship, it's going to put a strain on the relationship, because I'm going to feel forced to do things that I don't want. And I don't feel, I'm not even negotiating on my side. I'm not even standing up for myself. I'm just going along with it. Let's imagine the opposite, that I'm completely uncompromising and I don't care what your parameters are. I'm inflexible. It's going to be on this day. Well, that's also going to strain the relationship. So even if we're trying to reduce the risk of our relationship getting strained, and we're trying to maximize the well-being and the good sides of it, we have to be able to say no. We have to be able to disagree. And we have to be able to embrace a certain level of discomfort, because it still takes courage. And for some people, it's a terrifying experience to have to say, no, I'm sorry, that doesn't work for me, because their attachment style, because their fear, because their experiences have taught them that if they don't comply with someone, that's gonna be the end of it. So risk taking can exist in a lot of different ways. You can often risk the relationship or risk peace in the relationship. And in some forms, it's more of a bigger risk, like risk your physical safety or something like that, or psychological safety. But I think if we're reflecting on the positive side of the strategist that most of us are likely to be confronted with, I think it's really about being conscious of that game of probability, and assessing when we can risk a loss, how big of a loss we can actually risk, and when we also choose not to pursue certain things or not to go after certain goals. Concrete example, there are times and contexts not to have a tricky conversation about your relationship. Be a strategist. Your partner comes home exhausted, let's imagine, it's been a tough couple of months, and you feel the quality of the relationship just degrading, and you're scared, and you're both on edge, and you're both being triggered. Well, don't have that conversation in the middle of a fight. Don't have that conversation when you're both at your rope's end, and
Or
don't,
hungry.
yeah, or hungry. So yeah, that the strategic level there can be seen in a lot of different ways, but
Yeah.
I think it's just it's an interesting simplification of reality to reflect on some of these gambles that we can't help but make, but most of us don't really make consciously at this stage, or we maybe don't realize to what extent we actually have a choice when it comes to risk taking and going after what we really want. In personal or professional settings, it doesn't matter.
I think one of the examples of a strategist in everyday life, because of course every job can embody any of these archetypes. So today you could be a hunter, warrior, or strategist in any job by embodying that. And a great example, this year is a year where there's a lot of elections going on. Politics. To be a politician is very much around risk management. There's always going to be problems and risks down the line. So if you look at any politician who's taking really to heart their decisions and not just doing them out of policy or lectureship, there's very much that strategist role in it. Leadership, company leadership, entrepreneurs, basically jobs where you're having to daily manage a lot of uncertainty and risk. So if you're looking at this wheel of archetypes as a way of thinking, where should I embody life? How should I live my life by combining different archetypes? The strategist could be the mastery of both those two. You would have the warrior and the hunter together. And in fact, the mastery level of the third level here, this strategist is usually a combination of dancing with the aggression and the courage in balance. That's how those two play out. So being a strategist is also being able to have the courage and knowing when the aggression is needed and when it is not, and therefore being a risk manager as such. What would be a good reflection question, Jonas, for overall this path that we could sort of leave people with to reflect about? Do I want to be on this path of combat in my life, whether I'm going to be actually practicing martial arts or in other areas of my professional, personal hobby life?
I think maybe starting with the why level. Why am I fighting? Against myself, reality, other people. Like, why am I fighting? And if I come up with some degree of an answer to that question, is that something I can stand by? Am I fighting for the right reasons? Am I fighting for something or against something? And maybe a different way of phrasing it would be also just, what am I going after? What do I want? If I'm a hunter, I've got to prey. What is my objective? What is it that I am choosing to pursue? And then there's the question of the strategy. Indeed, how am I then training for this level of the warrior? More than just going out into the woods with my experience and my grandfather's bow and his old fishing tips. How am I practicing this choreography? How am I drilling my tolerance of fear, my mastery of my tools to get what I want? And yeah, to what extent am I being honest and disciplined enough to actually give myself a chance? And then at the final level, looking at it more as a complex equation, what is the cost benefit ratio like at the minute? For the level of discomfort that I'm putting myself through, for the ways, for how I'm paying for this in sweat, in blood, in tears, in money, what am I getting out of it? Is it actually yielding some degree of victory on the battlefield, or am I just on a losing streak, and do I need to maybe be honest about needing to change my strategy or change my ambition? If you go out with the military might of Portugal in the 17th century and your ambition is to conquer the world, that's maybe a bit steep. You can probably still do some great stuff. And I mean, I don't know why I chose that example. It's so random, but yeah,
Portugal actually in the 17th century were doing quite well. They were
yeah,
actually doing a lot of exploration. Yeah.
they did great, but there were certain things that didn't work out, and it wasn't one of the empires that lasted for the longest. It peaked early on compared to the other ones, if I remember correctly, but then it was outrivaled by the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French to some extent. But anyway, that's beside our points. But are you having do you have the resources to match your level of ambition, and are you going out on your missions and on your quests for the right reasons? And maybe as a little just observation from therapy's world, it often is more constructive to go from a positive than a negative. So if you can find something to fight for instead of something to fight against for a range of reasons, it can actually be quite useful. In the same way as if you're looking for a certain experience, let's imagine, what do you want? Well, I don't want bad relationships anymore. Well, maybe the answer the universe will give you to that is, okay, no relationships. Done. No bad relationships. You got what you wanted. But if you ask for it as a positive, it might yield something like, well, I want a satisfying enough balanced relationship. If the universe provides, that looks like something that's a little bit more satisfying. So it's just I mean, you see this in manifestation spiritual jargon all the time, like think in terms of positives. But there is some evidence to this. The brain, if I tell you don't think of crocodile breakdancing, it doesn't matter that I said don't think about it. You're gonna do it anyway. So if you tell your brain think of a calm Zen landscape, that's something that you can actually achieve instead of not thinking of the crocodile thing. So
don't think of the violent one. Of course, it's going to come back. Yeah.
So to the extent that you can try and carve out objectives for yourself phrased in a positive, it's a little bit less dangerous.
So just to wrap up this, like we talked about the path of combat archetypes. Hunter focused on courage, the warrior focused on aggression, the strategist focused on risk management, with symbolically martial arts, which is just one way of practicing that. Of course, you can practice those archetypes in any job, in any hobby, in any relation, because they're symbolic archetypes. Do you have any examples? Now, we've talked a lot about the sort of symbolic and philosophical side of it, but an actual example from martial arts or something that you've experienced where it's brought you something, enriched your life experience?
I got a life lesson from it when I was a teenager. I did as a kid I did judo, and then as a teenager I did Viet Vu Dao, and I noticed something that when I was like angry and emotional in a fight, I would generally get my ass handed to me. I would generally get my ass handed to me because I wasn't good, but it was especially bad when I was like angry and getting frustrated and getting pissed off. For me, it didn't translate. It's not like in the films where, the character goes berserk. He goes, into his anger, and then he channels his anger, and then he defeats all of his opponents. No, for me, it was just like the more angry I got, the worse I fought. And so that taught me a lesson about, okay, you can legitimately still choose to be in this fight, but you're going to have to start fighting with your own fear and your own emotion. It's not necessarily fear, it can be frustration before you even fight with this other dude. So that was a little lesson that I learned, especially in that dojo. And it's something that I've noticed translates to other areas of my life as well. You generally need the emotion. It's there for a reason. Even if you don't want it, it's there. You can't make it just go away. But you can kind of channel it and at least try to use it as fuel for something, or try and get something constructive out of it. But anger is rarely something that I use in its first, like in its pure form. What I try to do now as a practice is, if I'm angry about something, first I'll go into the internal space and I will try and observe and understand which part of me is angry, what needs does it resonate with, what angered me about this situation, before I automatically decide to tap into that, because I've noticed about myself that I can be quite reactive, and I could get angry in a way that's completely counterproductive if I don't watch myself. But I don't just tell myself don't be angry. I hold it, digest it, but then my responsibility is to do something about it. So if someone angers me that's worth it, I'm not talking about a traffic situation, but if I'm really angry because of something that has happened with someone that I care about, then it's my responsibility to go through the discomfort of putting it on the table, but not in its pure form, not by just going and being like, "Wah!" and just like screaming at the person, because for me that doesn't work. It's not a reliable strategy. My tongue moves faster than my brain, and cuts unnecessarily deep. So yeah.
Nice metaphor, like the tongue as a sword, indeed. Yeah. Thank you, Jonas. There was a lot of insights from today, and I think like overall, if we zoom out from this archetype wheel today, the idea of this, of course, is not to encourage a particular life path, but it's more about helping people to discover that there is completely a huge amount of choice around how you can embody your life experience beyond those silos of work roles, hobby roles, and family roles that we tend to play out. But that is actually the idea of this is that you can color in any of the number of archetypes that you feel that you've embodied in the past, the ones that you're embodying right now, and most importantly, the ones that you might want to embody more of in the future. And when you start coloring in a number collection of them, it might be 3, 5, or whatever, you can then turn those into a really powerful question, like to design your life as such. If you think of design thinking, applying that to yourself, it's like, okay, how might I embody the archetype of the strategist and some of the other archetypes from here, for example, the ambassador for some idea. So the strategist and the ambassador combined, how might I embody that? Suddenly, when you ask that question to yourself in journal reflections or to other people around you who know you well, they can actually come up with some very interesting new ways for you to experience things by either changing jobs, changing positions in your job, responsibilities, or even trying new hobbies. So the idea is to unlock new potential, open up your mind to different ways of experiencing life than just the traditional silos. That's the whole purpose of this exercise, along with some great conversations with my brother Jonas. So thank you. And we'll be seeing each other again in the next episode on some of the last few ones that we haven't yet covered. So thank you, Jonas. Have a great sunny Marseille afternoon.
Thank you. You too. Take good care.
Cheers.